very much. Thanks, Chairman. And it's a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to address the Institute this afternoon on this topic, which is, as you know, extremely important for Ireland and indeed for Europe. It comes at an interesting time, both in terms of a new government having just assumed power in Ireland, and as we approach a vital stage in the negotiations on the future of the CAP. It is the case also that agriculture and food have entered centre stage once more in world discussion across a range of fora. And I'm delighted that this body, which makes an outstanding contribution to policy consideration here, is also focusing on this topic at this time, and will do later on in the year as well in a broader context. When we refer to the agri-food sector, we generally mean that to include agriculture, forestry, food and drink, and it is today one of the most important indigenous manufacturing elements in the Irish economy. Bear in mind that when Ireland joined the EEC, as it then was in 1973, there were 230,000 farms. The average size was just over 22 hectares. The annual output of the sector was in the region of 560 million. Our main export market was the United Kingdom. Since then, the CAP has transformed the farming and food industry in this country. It has played a central role in the last 3.5 decades of development. It has increased farmers' incomes and has transformed living standards to the benefit of primary agriculture, the food industry, and the wider rural community. Although the number of farmers has declined, farm size has increased significantly from 22 to 32 hectares, and agriculture's contribution to the national economy is hugely significant. The agri-food sector is now Ireland's largest indigenous industry. It is responsible for 150,000 jobs, has an annual output of 24 billion, with a huge export orientation running into several billions. But its importance stretches well beyond its economic impact. It contributes enormously to the development of our rural society, with a multiplier effect in terms of social and environmental benefits throughout the country. Its importance can be illustrated by just a couple of stats. 6.3% of gross value added, 7.5% of employment, 10% of exports, and 30% of net foreign earnings. Last year, exports of Irish food and drink grew by 11% to a value of almost 8 billion. Quite a spectacular performance, which serves to illustrate the importance of the sector. Those export figures are particularly significant in the context of the new programme for government, which identifies, and I quote, that Ireland's economic recovery must be export-led. One of the key targets set out in the Food Harvest 2020 strategy, which I'll return to later, is to grow the value of exports to 12 billion, an increase of 42% compared to 2007. The agri-food sector will play a vital role all round in our economic recovery. 2010 was a good year for farming, with the operating surplus in the sector increasing by 46% to 2.28 billion. This improvement was due to a combination of positive trading conditions for the dairy commodities, a large increase in the output value of cereals, and a significant level of direct payments. The prospects for the industry remain good for 2011, and the ambitious targets set out in the Food Harvest 2020 will drive further growth in the wider economy. In other words, there is very tangible confidence within the sector at present, one which is not just due to the economic conditions, but also due to the acknowledgement of the crucial role the sector plays for our country. There was a feeling of being taken for granted and treated as a yesterday sector, while the knowledge economy thundered along. Nothing could be further from the truth, and any failure to recognise the role of knowledge, research and science in the agriculture and food sectors is a very dangerous failure indeed. I'd like to place this nationally important industry in its wider global and EU context. The sector is not just economically important, but the reality is that agriculture, food production and food security are basic to mankind's survival. We are all aware that the world population is estimated to increase by about a third between now and 2050. This 2 billion increase will primarily be in developing countries where there is already pressure on resources such as land and water. The net effect is that the FAO estimates that business as usual, global food production will have to increase by about 70% to meet this demand. Account has to be taken of the impact of increasing urbanization, of affluence and purchasing power in developing countries. Urbanization and income rise together are leading to dietary changes with an increase in demand for animal products and more processed foods, with the FAO OECD Agriculture Outlook to 2019 projecting that global meat consumption to increase by 2% per annum and beef by 1.5% per annum. Ireland is a major meat and dairy producing country with a huge exporting capability. Our production significantly exceeds indigenous consumption in key products, such as 617% for beef, 344% for sheep meat, 573% for cheese, and 915% for butter. As we are well resourced with land, water, a resilient farming community and a progressive food processing sector, Ireland has the capacity and the capability to meet the increasing demand and to make a greater contribution to global food supply. However, on a global scale, agriculture is one of the first markers of climate change. There is no doubt that globally food production is threatened, and recent extreme events have caused shocks in production which have triggered food spikes and price volatility. These complex and interrelated issues are being addressed at EU level, where solutions are being sought to the dual challenge of ensuring the necessary increased food production and, at the same time, taking steps to adapt agriculture to climate change and to improving its contribution to cross-sectoral efforts to mitigate climate change. This will take time and is part of the current discussions on CAP and the wider UN attempts at reaching a global comprehensive agreement in Durban in South Africa in December 2011. When the CAP was designed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the primary focus was on production of sufficient volumes to meet European food demand and ensuring farmers have sufficient rewards to remain in active production. Although the aims of the CAP have not changed, and indeed they were reinforced and reaffirmed in the Lisbon Treaty, time has moved on, and the CAP has been successfully shaped and adapted to meet the circumstances and the needs of the times. The extent of the reforms of the CAP over the years is often not fully understood or appreciated. The first serious modification was the introduction of milk quotas in 1984. I'll come back to that. An initiative to curb EU milk production in response to surplus of supplies. The McSharry reforms in 1992 represented a major change of direction. Price support levels were reduced for a number of commodities in exchange for direct payments to farmers to compensate them for loss of income. The Agenda 2000 reform, the second major reform of the CAP, reinforced the move from market supports to direct payments and intensified the emphasis on food safety and on the environment. The most fundamental reform started out as a midterm review of the CAP in 2003 and brought about what's known as full decoupling of direct payments from production, in the case of livestock production, milk production and arable crops. To the surprise of many, Ireland was one of the first member states to embrace full decoupling in 2005. Breaking the link between support payments and production allowed farmers to become more market-oriented and in responding to consumer demands. The much maligned concept of cross-compliance was also born, whereby grant of payments was made conditional to farmers' compliance with a range of environmental, food safety and animal welfare standards. Cross-compliance has grown in importance in recent times as being a further basis on which to pay direct payments to farmers across the EU on top of the income support which remains fundamental. The result of all this is there is far more recognition now these days of the need to promote competitiveness and to foster sustainability in all dimensions. That is to say, economic environmental and social sustainability. It is also the case that the role of farming in the stewardship of the national landscape has been far more visible over the last decade and will provide a sound platform for the continued economic, environmental and social sustainability of rural Ireland. It's against this background that we are currently discussing the policy direction for the Common Agriculture Policy of the future. The current round of CAP reform discussions should be seen in the broader context of the EU budget review, the next multi-annual financial framework and the EU 2020 strategy, with its emphasis on smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. Forthcoming discussions on the EU budget are closely intertwined with the future of the CAP. Of the 975 billion in the current EU financial framework, expenditure on the CAP accounts for 410 billion. This represents about 40% of the EU budget, or some 0.48% of EU gross national income. It is estimated that Ireland will receive over 14 billion, or 1.4% of the total EU budget over the period of the current financial framework. Over 85% of this funding, some 12 billion, will come from the CAP. And while Ireland is set to become a net contributor to the overall EU budget over the lifetime of the next financial framework, Ireland's current ratio of benefits to contributions from the CAP is 1.89. So in view of this, and given our domestic budget constraints, it is in Ireland's interests to try to maintain the CAP budget at as high a level as possible in the next framework discussions. Proposals are expected from the Commission on the new financial framework in June of this year. Informal contacts with other member states suggest that there are two possible schools of thought regarding the agriculture share of the next framework, ranging from between the current nominal amount of funding and a 30% reduction. Our position on the CAP is very clear, and we are extremely active in articulating this throughout our dealings at EU, both formally and informally. Ireland wants to see a strong and properly resourced CAP in the future. This is a whole-of-government position. Aside from the budgetary resources argument, we firmly believe that the CAP actually deserves to maintain its current share of EU budget. Why? Well, primary agriculture sector covers 40% of the EU landmass, 40%, almost 80% if forestry is added. Primary agriculture also contributes 1.9% to gross value added in the Union and 5.6% to employment. The sector is an essential platform for the EU food and drink sector, representing 9% of industrial value. And of course, the sector is hugely important in the context of Europe's economic and industrial recovery. It contributes to all three priorities of the EU 2020 strategy of smart, green and inclusive growth. Its importance, incidentally, was acknowledged in the conclusions of the Heads of Government meeting in the Spring European Council. The Commission communication on the future of the CAP, released in November, states, and I quote, that the CAP should remain a strong common policy structured around its two pillars. Pillar 1 is direct payments and market supports, and Pillar 2 is the co-funded element of the wider rural development and investment measures. But to be meaningful, this will require appropriate resources that will have to be reflected in the new EU financial framework. There will be competing pressures for funds from many quarters, and we will have our work cut out to ensure an acceptable outcome for Irish agriculture. We support the three main objectives that are identified in the Commission communication: viable food production, sustainable management of natural resources, and balanced rural development. We also welcome the commitments to the continuation of decoupled direct payments, the retention and enhancement of market management measures, and the further development of the current rural development themes. Having led the charge towards full decoupling, which I said is the separation of direct payments from the actual output production per farm, having led that charge, we firmly believe that decoupled direct payments are the most efficient mechanism to support farm incomes and to offer some degree of protection in the short-term volatility in market prices, while allowing the farmer to respond to market signals over the medium to long term. However, as we saw in the 2009 episodes in the milk sector, it is necessary, and it will remain necessary in our view, to supplement this with well-targeted market support measures where exceptional market conditions warrant it. It is the case that in 2009, when the dairy market went rapidly downhill, that in the absence of EU market supports, that trajectory was continuing. It stopped at roughly 20 cents a litre for Ireland, which is quite difficult for dairy producers to survive, but it was heading on downwards if the EU hadn't intervened in the way it did. The fact that Ireland used all its influence to bring about that involvement by the EU, I won't say that, but that was the case. With growing global demand for food and the ending of milk quotas, our agri-food sector faces new opportunities for growth. But these opportunities will only be fully realised if our farms become as competitive as possible. This will require considerable adaptation and structural change. It is important that we should actively support the farmers through this process via a strong second pillar of the CAP that provides targeted aid for structural change and modernisation. As to the details, the Commission communication raises issues about the distribution of CAP funds between Member States. It also raises issues about the future model for direct payments, and that is to say the distribution of CAP payments within Member States. Often confused, totally different, and that distinction needs to be fully understood. On the former, that's the distribution between Member States, Ireland's main concern is to secure a system that provides our fair share of funding that supports the viability of Irish farming. There has been some discussion about using objective criteria to resolve the distribution issue. The difficulty, as I see it, is that we could all, across all 27 Member States, come up with a combination of objective criteria that would best suit, but we would never reach agreement. Instead, we believe we should deal with the issue directly at political level. To achieve an acceptable outcome, we believe we have to look at the current average payment per hectare in both pillars of the CAP and negotiate from there. The initial comparison across Member States is crucial, as that is where the negotiations will start. We believe we have made significant progress in having the correct starting point used. That's only the beginning. The stakes are high, given the value of the single payments to Ireland, which amount to 1.3 billion per year, and not to mention the other payments under Pillar 2. Second issue, the issue of payment models, that is the distribution of funds to farmers within a Member State, is an entirely separate matter. Current Commission thinking favours a tiered payment that would, in Ireland's case, result in flattening average payment levels across the country and involve massive transfers of payments between sectors, between regions and between farmers. This is a particularly difficult issue for us. Instead, we favour allowing Member States considerable flexibility in this area, as is currently the case. The agro-ecological and social conditions of farming vary hugely within the Union, as does public perception of the role of agriculture in the economy. We should not, therefore, we believe, impose a one-size-fits-all on all Member States. With regard to the proposed greening of the direct payments, we are concerned that we should not underplay or undervalue the substantial environmental public good already being delivered through cross-compliance requirements in the current system. We welcome the commitment in the communication to simplification, and we think we must bear this in mind when discussing any further greening of the single payment. The tolerance for increased complexity in all of this area is at a fairly low level. The Commission communication is at a first step, and it's a first step in what will be a lengthy process of negotiation. At last month's Council of Agriculture Ministers, a series of conclusions on the general orientation of CAP after 2013 were adopted by the Presidency. These had the support of the majority of Member States. The Commission will be releasing its impact analysis on the various options over the coming months. It's expected to bring about further proposals in the next EU multinational framework in June, and to publish the full detailed legal proposals for CAP at the end of the year. The plan is to reach agreement under the Danish presidency of the EU in the first half of 2012. But, as is the case with many negotiations, the timeline is not set in stone. The dynamics of the negotiations will be influenced by the fact that this is one of the first major negotiations to take place among 27 member states with co-decision between the Council and the European Parliament. There is therefore the prospect, increasingly likely, that these negotiations will come to a head during the Irish presidency of the EU in the first half of 2013. We are preparing for this eventuality, and I must add it's an eventuality which many other member states, for some odd reason, would favour, that ball lands on our court. However, whatever about the timeline of the negotiations, Ireland's priorities are unlikely to change. The crucial issues for us have been clear from day one, and we will continue to press these issues in the forthcoming discussions. We have, as is well known over the years, been able to successfully negotiate on CAP and EU agriculture, not just in formal sessions, but by investing hugely in influencing thinking within the Commission and in other member states, and within informal groupings of member states. In an EU of 27, this will be increasingly important. Whatever changes the EU decides internally to make to the CAP, the outcome of the international trade negotiations will be another determinant of future policy framework for the Irish agri-sector. While negotiations on the WTO Doha development round seem to be in some difficulty at present, negotiations for a free trade agreement with the Mercosur countries continue apace. Ireland has consistently expressed serious reservations about the Mercosur negotiations. We fear they may compromise our policy space in relation to CAP. Notwithstanding any reservations we have about a WTO deal, we believe that the multilateral approach through WTO is preferable in that it would at least provide us with a greater possibility of reciprocal benefits. We have particular concerns about the impact of a Mercosur deal would have on our beef sector. The beef quota sought by Mercosur countries would most likely comprise high-value cuts of meat, both fresh and frozen, which would be in direct competition with Irish exports and could seriously undermine our beef industry. And by high-value cuts, I'm talking about, the cuts of beef animals that you'd prefer to eat, that you might cook on a Sunday with barbecue, or high-value cuts for restaurants and so on. I think a few facts on this are very important. Very, very important. The total EU beef market amounts to 7.8 million tonnes. That's the consumption, 7.8 million tonnes. Within this, the size of the market for high-value beef amounts to 600,000 tonnes. That's 600,000 out of 7.8 million. A quota of, say, for argument's sake, 300,000 tonnes, which is being sought by Mercosur, would be a huge issue, therefore, for Ireland. This segment of the market provides 25% of the returns to producers, although it only accounts for 6% of the volume. We have pressed our concerns very strongly within the EU, and it has undertaken to employ some mitigating measures, basically by splitting the beef quota into various segments. The details have yet to be revealed, and of course mitigating measures will be of little use if the beef quota itself is too large. We shall see. The Commission's own impact assessment is due to be released later this month. Ireland has already looked for a detailed analysis of the impacts and a full discussion at the Council of Agriculture Ministers and in the European Parliament before any offers are exchanged with the Mercosur countries. My new Minister, Minister Coveney, has also drawn attention to the negative climate change impacts that would arise from replacing efficient Irish production with output from regions with much higher greenhouse gas emissions for their beef production, which is the case in relation to Brazil, for example. In a recent bilateral meeting which we had in France on St. Patrick's Day, or the day after, we agreed, along with the French Minister, to undertake a joint initiative to highlight the greenhouse gas efficiency of EU beef compared to others, so that this could be taken into account in the Mercosur discussions. In relation to climate change, I want to make a point, first of all, as you will be aware, that Ireland is unique in that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our agriculture sector as a proportion of our overall emissions are significantly higher than the EU average of 9%. In Ireland, agriculture sector amounts for 29% of Ireland's total emissions. This clearly demonstrates the contrast between Ireland and most other developed countries, where a higher proportion of economic wealth is generated from industry and less from agriculture. Due to the high proportion of greenhouse gas emissions associated with our agriculture compared to other member states, our current post-Kyoto target to reduce national emissions by 20% will disproportionately affect Irish agriculture, and that disproportionate effect is compounded by the acknowledged lack of cost-effective abatement technology currently available. It has been acknowledged by a variety of research, including analysis by this institute here, notwithstanding the emergence of new technologies, the potential to deliver further emissions in the agriculture sector is limited to no more than approximately 4%. Irish farmers understand their environment and have a genuine concern for it. They know that all farming is a matter of inputs and outputs, and they know that if those are not managed properly, production systems will be neither sustainable nor profitable. I firmly believe that increasing efficiencies in Irish milk and meat production is the key to improving the overall sustainability of the sector. Improved efficiency will deliver a double dividend in terms of profit for farmers and a reduction in emissions to the atmosphere. If my many years in agriculture in the department have taught me anything about changing farmer behaviour, it's this. There is nothing but nothing drives changed behaviour faster than increased profits to the farmer. Thanks to the efforts of our colleagues in Teagasc, the essential link between emission reduction and improved farm profits is now firmly established. Lower carbon intensity means higher profitability. Farmers have been doing this consistently since the mid-1990s. Emissions from agriculture have been falling steadily, while outputs from the sector have been increasing. The uptake of new technology and practices at farm level has inspired a significant improvement in efficiencies, and this improvement is being built on. We all recognise that climate change is a most pressing challenge, but inextricably linked to finding the solutions to climate change is the imperative of providing access to affordable, sustainably produced food for all the world's inhabitants. I mentioned earlier the predicted increase in world population from 6.7 billion to 9.2 billion by 2050. However, the number of chronically undernourished people on the planet now stands at almost 1 billion, or one person in every 6. The UN also estimates that by 2050, an increase of 70% in current food output will be required to eliminate hunger and meet the food needs of a burgeoning population. Recently, the European Joint Research Centre published an evaluation of the livestock sector's contribution to greenhouse gas, which showed that based on life cycle analysis, Ireland is among the most efficient producers of food in Europe, most efficient producer of milk and pork, among the most efficient producers of beef, poultry and eggs. The report shows that Ireland is a more efficient producer of beef and lamb than Brazil and New Zealand, the countries most likely to replace product on the European market if Irish production declined. As a substantial producer and exporter of high-quality, sustainably produced food, I believe that Ireland must exploit our natural advantage and expertise in food production in order to assist in meeting the long-term increased global demand for food. In relation to the climate change negotiation process, we must ensure that sustainably produced food from Ireland and other efficient producers is not replaced by food produced from farming systems with higher emissions and possible ecosystem damage associated with that replacement. I referred earlier to the export growth targets set out in our Food Harvest 2020 strategy, which was published last July and which represents the strategic blueprint for the development of our agri-food, fish and forestry sectors. The strategy contains 215 recommendations and has a series of ambitious growth targets to be achieved by 2020. Increase the value of primary output of agriculture by 1.5 billion, 33% increase. Improve the value-added sector by 3 billion. achieve an export target of 12 billion from a figure of 8 last year, a 42% increase. Increase milk production by 50% and 20% the value of beef output. The level of ministerial commitment is particularly important in terms of providing confidence that the government's commitment remains to this strategy. We have been fortunate to have successive ministers, notwithstanding the change in government, who are now personally committed to the strategy and to its targets. Like all strategies, delivery is the key. The high-level implementation committee to drive this, which is chaired now by the Minister, has met 3 times, and Minister Coveney, my new Minister, will shortly chair his first meeting. The first progress report on the implementation of the strategy is due for publication in July and will outline the progress to date. Already, an action plan has been agreed for the dairy sector, setting out the necessary actions to be taken to reach the 50% milk target output. Each action is attributed to one or more player in the sector and will be followed up. The game has already started, and the infrastructure, including the in-calf heifers, are already in place, already being put in place. It will be challenging, no doubt, it will be challenging. Not least among the challenges how to get from here to there. When quotas go in 2015, because in the period until that there will be a milk quota. The milk quota year ends on the 31st of March, so 2 days ago, whatever, five days ago, last weekend. We don't know yet whether Ireland incurred a super levy. There's speculation that we may touch and go, but that's this year. But we have to get until 2015 when quotas go without falling off the cliff. So that is a challenge. So to gear up to increase by 50% from 2015 on without incurring a major super levy in the run-up to that period will be a finely tuned balancing act. This is something that we've taken up with the Commission and with our colleagues in the EU Council, because we believe that there are possible ways in which a soft landing could be provided. There's only 3 or 4 countries who are interested in achieving that, who need it, and we're working closely with them. But so far, the Commission are very, very reluctant to open up that package. There has been wide buy-in to the strategy. All stakeholders have bought in, and in less than a year, a number of important initiatives have already taken place. Brand Ireland concept is being developed, initially through the work of Board Bia, and is being centred on the reputational enhancement of food exports based on sustainable criteria. The Food Harvest 2020 document was incorporated into the Government's National Recovery Plan, and which has since translated into the policy of the new government as well. As a department, we're prepared to work with all the relevant stakeholders to ensure the targets are achieved, and working in the sector, we can be assured of our commitment to work with them to create the conditions and the environment to ensure that it reaches its full potential. Agriculture has emerged from a very difficult period in 2009, with prices across the main sectors increasing through 10 and 11. Thankfully, 2010 was a good year for the farming sector, with a surplus increasing by 46% to 2.28 billion. There is, I think you'll agree, a general and tremendous positivity around agriculture. The longer-term outlook, with increased demand for food, complemented by an increasingly sophisticated market for new consumer food products in emerging economies, is adding to this positive sentiment. At EU level, there is a growing realisation that food security is a critically important issue, and from a national perspective, this is accompanied by an appreciation that the agri-food sector, with its strong export focus and its heavy dependence on domestic inputs, can play a central role in this country's economic recovery. Our aim in the department is to negotiate an acceptable outcome for the new post-2013 CAP, within which we can develop and grow the agri-food sector to meet the now agreed and endorsed targets and objectives. And I'm confident we can do both. Thank you.